He just, his USB is saying that there's power, more power needed than he supplied.
Do you want to just go out to
that? Yeah, but we already got it.
Oh, you already got it?
Yeah. There's just one light. You have one that you're like, this is not ours.
I just don't know how, I don't think we can plug
I know
one
Happy bought some new ones.
They look new.
Yeah. Yeah, they're not ours.
Gotcha.
That's how we told ours away from the unmarked ones. We were like, all right.
I can put on another USB from Savannas with another USB. I got it on my laptop.
I'm Hunter. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, I'll be traveling next week.
Yeah.
I will send you an email and I'll connect you with
Unless
a
you think it's something that I can understand.
So, yeah.
So I can try that. We can talk about it. I don't know how to get a live show.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Because I remember there's one that doesn't work, right?
I'll be around that. I have another.
Okay.
Second part of the sentence. Oh.
Device needs more power than me.
I just gave you a different USB.
It's all about how you
Yeah, because we...
I will. You can type it in. It's a no. Really good experience.
The shots.
Yeah.
Dr. Hager, where's the rest of your class?
Yeah, what are you thinking would be on top?
They should pick up 3 minutes. I have 3 minutes.
All right.
So,
You sure?
highlighted, perfect. And the lighting, yeah. Is also really bad in here. These notes are also, I didn't remember how to do it. Okay, and then return to main. Start from the
Where they're coming from.
Not really.
But if he gets hard enough cold snaps, then he gets back. Right.
Is this balloon part of your talk? No, I found it over there. I'll put it in the back. Yeah.
You like it.
You know, I just want to make sure.
You gotta be careful. That's true.
So wait, look at word. I like the mustache. Better, honestly, better with it button. No, yeah. You just have to commit to it. You gotta do it.
Live.
So wait, look at you. We were sitting and I was like, it looked like one side was a little slow, but I think that was just because, like, it's pretty heavy.
That last part was critically important.
Don't touch those. Just touch your arrows and your laser.
What she works in, and say that I want everything to be static.
Y'all,
So I still like this.
I want
Everyone I said no. I gave that's a mustache first.
do it.
Yeah. It's 4 o'clock. It's my pleasure to introduce today Dr. Bob McCleary from the University of Florida. Bob got his bachelor's degree up at Cornell University and then did Peace Corps for 2 years. So several of us have Peace Corps in common. It's a really cool story today. Hopefully we'll get into how Peace Corps led to some of these African things he's been involved with the rest of your life. I have a Peace Corps master's and PhD both at Texas A&M University, and he's been at University of Florida as an associate professor of wildlife ecology for the past 10 years. Graduated over 38 graduate students and published over 110 papers already, and still going strong. And we had a really great visit with him.
No, I'm done.
Not done.
No, I'm done.
And so today he's going to be talking about maintaining diverse wildlife in Africa's rapidly changing savannas. So please help me out.
Hi, everyone. This is my first, will be my first overnight in South Carolina, so great to be here. I've really enjoyed engaging with most of you guys throughout the day, and hope that we can continue this evening. There are plans for this evening and tomorrow. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research program in Southern Africa and how it relates to African savannas. But what I want to start by doing is put it into a broad context of how I view conservation. And we were in the middle of a conservation crisis. This crisis has been considered the planet's 6th mass extinction event. And to give you some idea of what we're talking about, I'm going to show you this publication where what they did is they looked at background rates of extinction. Extinction is a very normal evolutionary process. Things need to go extinct so other new species can be created. And this is what the normal background rates of extinction would look like for members of the animal kingdom. But if we compare that to the rates of extinction that we've seen over the last 500 years, we can see that the background here is much lower than our accelerated rates of extinction that we are seeing for mammals and birds and other vertebrate species. Now, in the context of that, this is clearly a global problem, this extinction problem, this mass extinction event. But I'm going to argue here, and you can either buy it or not, but I'll make an argument that we should not be looking at conservation the same in all places because they have different levels of uniqueness. And I'm going to argue that Africa is unique for one very distinct reason, and that is because they still have an intact, large mammalian fauna, where the rest of the world does not. And if we were to look at the proportion of large mammals remaining in a system, and we look at when humans entered the system, which is the black dot that we can see up there, you can see that Africa generally still has 70-80% of its large mammals, things such as hippos, rhinos, pachyderms, and the things that eat them. And when we compare this to when humans entered Australia, North America, Madagascar, we could do the same for South America, you can see that most of those large mammals have been lost from the system. And this has huge ecological impacts for how the system works. And a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about are some of the impacts that large mammals have on a system. We'll get there. But so I can't give a talk about Africa and not talk about elephants. But I'm saving that for last. So we will get to the elephants. So just bear with me if I have to talk about some other stuff in the meantime. So in the context of a unique place with a unique mammalian fauna, there are some incredible challenges happening in Africa. The first of which, if we were to look at the projected population growth, by the end of this century, depending on whether you trust the IUCN, half of the world will be African. And let me say that again to make sure I'm clear on that. Half of the world will be African. That is a huge demographic shift from Asia to Africa. And if you walk around and you spend time in Africa and travel around like I do, most of the population is under 15 years old. Right? There is going to be a huge demographic boom in this part of the world. So we're going to see incredible population growth. Coupled with that, there's going to be a demand for agriculture. And this is going to come from, one, a growing population, and two, from the fact that people, their tastes are changing. There's going to be increased wealth, and with that comes a change in agricultural processes, and with that, it's all coupled in with a changing climate that is changing both the rainfall, the temperature, and the amount of carbon. I will focus probably most on carbon, on how that is changing this system. So those are some of the challenges that we're facing when we're trying to maintain wildlife in this system. And particularly, I'm going to focus on African savannas. Now, when we think about savannas, this is a transition area. It's a transition area between forests and grasslands, right? So if I were to define a savanna, it's something that has a continuous grass layer, like we can see here, but it has a discontinuous or broken canopy. If I have a closed canopy, I effectively have a forest. If I have no trees, I have a grassland. So this is a somewhere transition in between the two. And the way that this system is maintained as a transition between the two is a function of the amount of rainfall that they get, the amount of times that it burns, and the interactions with animals. So those are the three things that keep it in this state. And what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking a lot about the vegetation and the interactions that animals have with them and how they perceive the environment. And in this savannas, in the African savannas, there are three distinct layers. There is our grass layer that we talked about. Here's our continuous grass layer. We have a shrub layer. There's a suite of trees, woody plants that only grow, say, 10 to 15 feet. That's our shrub layer, and above that we have large trees, and there's our tree canopy layer. I'm going to be talking about three of those, but I just want to define that kind of before we move forward. And the other thing I want to make clear, and I want to try to break our North American mold of looking at systems, and that a system should look a certain way, and we can't really say that about African savannas. I'm going to use the word dynamic, and what I mean is that they change rapidly. They change over time, and they change over space. So we can go to an area, and today it might look like a thicket, and then an elephant comes through for a couple weeks, and it is no longer a thicket, and that is perfectly normal. So we expect to see changes over time and over space. There is no climax community. We just expect to see a very diverse, complex, dynamic system. That is what defines savannas. So I'm going to focus on the challenges. I gave you broadly the challenges for African conservation. I'm going to focus on these three things for my talk today, and these are the challenges for African savannas. I'm going to talk about increased agricultural production and what the influence that has on wildlife and how can we try to maximize that. I'm going to talk about this process of encroachment when we see a dominant shrub layer that sometimes chokes out the grass layer, and how that is going to influence wildlife. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is how do we manage wildlife in the protected lands that we have. So those are three challenges I want to try together in this talk over the next 40 minutes. So I'm going to start with agriculture. And over the last 20 years, we have seen an incredible boon in agriculture in savanna systems for a number of reasons. One, these are very fertile soils. Two, Africa now has access to global markets that they never had before, and they have dammed and irrigated this system, and they can grow things year-round. This is the only place in the world where this picture is taken that they have an 11-month growing cycle for sugarcane. Year-round, 11 months, it's done, full thing, haul it off, and where does it go? To the EU. And we are seeing this with soybeans, we are seeing this with corn, we're seeing this with all kinds of crops. So this kind of intensive agriculture is replacing typical rain-fed agriculture where people are growing things that grows based on local rain patterns. So this is changing our landscape drastically, and to kind of overlay or put juxtaposed to each other where we see production, and with the darker shades here being more production of agricultural products, more intensive, and we overlay that with savannas, you can see why I'm focusing on savannas. These areas are matching up very closely to these areas. These areas have been underutilized for crop production, and there are multinational companies that are putting a lot of effort in towards developing these for agriculture. So traditionally, a conservation view that we would have of something like this, a broad landscape change. Like we've got a traditional view for this. We've got the answer. What we'll do is we'll just set some areas aside. We've got protected areas. They're protected. Nothing's going to happen there. And in Africa, we've got about 14% of the land mass is protected. Now, the IUCN and some other studies suggest you need about 30% of your land mass set aside for conservation to have a kind of meaningful influence or to kind of preserve the diversity that you have. So we are woefully short of the amount of conservation needed. And there's another very important point here, which is a lot of the largest protected areas that we can see here, and I'm talking about some of those up there and some of these, are in the least productive lands. They are in effectively deserts with minimal net primary production where no one was living. So the answer to our conservation problems and stopping land use change and conserving what diversity we still have is not going to be answered by protected areas alone. I think it's part of the answer, but it's not going to be done by it alone. So when we first started tackling this and said, okay, well, how do we start looking at diversity in savannas knowing that there's going to be agriculture everywhere? Well, our first question was a pretty simple one. How does agricultural systems, how do intensive agricultural systems change wildlife? Period. That was our very simple starting point that we went from. So this is one of my first graduate students that we had down there. And this shows you, this is a savanna here, and right up there is a hard edge. This is common throughout the entire region, right up next to the nature reserve or park, whatever we want to call it there. You can see row crop agriculture, and this is common throughout lots of southern Africa and areas of Africa. And so what we did is we put some transects. We put actually a couple hundred of these transects in 7 protected areas throughout, spaced them apart, and we looked at birds, we looked at insects, and we looked at small mammals. And over 750 meters, 350 meters into the conservation area, and 375 meters into the agriculture. And here's just broadly and quickly what we found was nothing that was all that earth-shocking, but common patterns that we see across the planet. If we look in conservation areas, well, we find that there's not that many of these. That's a multi-mammate mouse, which has 12 nipples, which means that it reproduces an average of 12 young at a time. They're very fecund. They're very good generalists, and there's some of them in conservation areas and agricultural areas, they start going through the roof. You're catching them in about every trap that you have out there. And then when we look at specialist species, things like our senge or our elephant shrew there, well, in conservation areas, we do catch them, and as soon as you hit that break, they're gone, right? So over 750 meters, and we found this for insects and birds and everything, the communities change drastically. I'm not going to say that agricultural areas don't have value for wildlife. They have value for some wildlife. But the communities are changed drastically. So that led us to our next question. So if that's the case, if they are changing wildlife, but not, they're viable for some wildlife, how do we take landscapes? How do we scale this up? And how do we make landscapes that maximize wildlife diversity in them? And there have been some theories that have been suggested. One of this idea is landscape heterogeneity. And the idea behind the landscape heterogeneity hypothesis is that if you have lots of different types of land uses, you've got some agriculture, you've got some urbanization, you've got some rain-fed agriculture, you've got some protected areas, the more different types of land uses you have, and the more complex patterns that you have them, the more diversity you will have of wildlife. That's the hypothesis. Now, there has been some studies that suggest that this does increase biodiversity, but there were huge gaps to this when we started this work. And the first gap was, well, not all heterogeneity is the same. There's very different types of heterogeneity or complexity. I'm going to break out what those are. And we wouldn't expect that maybe all taxonomic groups would respond the same. A lot of this work had been done on birds. And we would expect that maybe birds would respond differently than things like dung beetles or mammals. So we wanted to see, can we broadly say, hey, listen, we've got the answer to your conservation problems. Make the most heterogeneous landscapes that you can. It's good. You don't need to worry about anything. So that, if we were following this hypothesis. So we went out and tested these. And I want to give you some idea of how you can conceptualize the idea of landscape heterogeneity. And this is from a paper from Lenore Farrig at Cornell University. And we've got composition, which is the number of different types of land uses. Right, so we can have very simple composition. Like I've got 2 types of landscapes here. It's very simple. I can have very complex composition. I can have a lot of different types of landscapes. And then I can have configuration, which is the patterns and shapes of those landscapes. So I can have very complex landscapes. And if I put those all together, I can have areas that have very low configuration and composition, a couple land uses, very simple shapes, all the way up to areas that are very complex with lots of different land uses and lots of different shapes, right? So that's just how we can conceptualize the two components of heterogeneity. And so then we went out and we quantified the different land uses using satellite imagery and some ground truthing throughout this area that I'm going to be talking about a lot. It's a tiny little dot in Africa called Swaziland or Eswatini. I'll use both words. They changed the name because mail was getting sent to Switzerland, and they got tired of their mail getting sent to Switzerland, so they changed the name from Swaziland to Eswatini. I digress. This is where we work. We quantified the landscape. We put a number of points out there, 15 points to capture this gradient of heterogeneity, and we went out, and this is where the fun is, we went out and sampled lots of different plots within each of our landscapes. We sampled these 500 meter by 500 meter plots with 50 meter plots embedded in it. That's really irrelevant, but we sampled ants, we sampled mesomammals, we sampled dung beetles, and we sampled birds. And the reason that we chose these, it seems kind of random, but we might expect them to respond to the environment on different scales and to different processes. So we were actually picking them for the reasons that they should respond to this differently. And so what we found was that these areas colored in red suggest that there was a significant response, so that all of these taxonomic groups were responding to composition. Very little were responding to the complexity of shapes, which is configuration. So lots of different types of land uses were shaping how these species were responding. When we looked at, did they respond the same way to these things? Well, what we found is things like birds, which a lot of the original research were done on, as we increase these number of different types of land uses, well, birds seem to do quite well. And they do increase through that. But when we start looking at things like dung beetles, and if you guys haven't worked on dung beetles, they are a very fun system to work out. You just need to put some dung out, and they come, they start rolling them, and they bury them. Very fun. Okay, so we put them out in the environment. We study them, and they have a huge, important ecological role. And what you find is that the more different types of land use they have, they disappear. Why? Because they want large swaths of areas with big herbivores defecating on the ground so they can roll the dung, right? So there's no benefit to them to having all these different types of composition. So in the end, what we did find is that composition matters, right? So lots of different types of land uses matter, and it might be negative to some species or taxonomic groups, but positive to others. And so what we've started to do is think about with our land planning and managers there is how can we couple large areas that are homogeneous, that are the same for things like dung beetles, and how can we couple them with areas with lots of different types of land uses so that within an entire landscape we can maximize the diversity within that area. And I want to give you one study just to show you how we think this might work. This is a recent PhD student of mine, Julie, and Julie was working on bats in the region, and we knew that most of the bats, this one particular group of bats that you were looking at, were roosting in the protected areas. And they were doing quite well roosting in the protected areas, but when they left and went to go forage, they left all of those protected areas, and they went into areas up here, which are our communal areas, and they went over the sugarcane, and in very compositionally diverse landscapes, we got lots of these bats. So they were using both different types of landscapes, and it was maximizing their use of this landscape. So I don't see these things as competitive necessarily, and I think that's kind of one thing that we've pitted against each other, and I don't think we need to. We need to think about how do we maximize them together. So one thing that bats don't respond well to, and most animals don't respond well to, is this. And this is what we would call classic shrub encroachment, bush encroachment. What it is we're seeing a dominant shrub layer, which is choking out the grass. Now, there's a lot of speculation on why this happens, and there's been some experiments, and people suggest this is from overgrazing, lack of fire, too frequent fire, but there is a growing amount of evidence that the strongest reason for this has to do with carbon in the atmosphere. And I will briefly explain to you the reasoning behind this is plants take carbon out of the atmosphere and turn it into organic matter, right? Carbohydrates, other things. That's what they do through photosynthesis, magic. But they do it in different ways. And woody plants, C3 plants, effectively in this system, the more carbon in the atmosphere, the more effective they are at turning that inorganic matter into organic matter. But C4 plants, which are grasses, do quite well at low carbon systems, but then they don't maximize it as this carbon increases. You guys have all seen something like this before, and if we're doing a broad experiment where we just keep dumping carbon into the atmosphere, it should change the competitive advantage of C3 and C4 plants. So we would expect to see a competitive advantage of those woody plants that I just showed you, and because of that, we see this as a global problem. And if you look throughout the literature and you search for the term bush encroachment, shrub encroachment, even here in coastal plains, pine systems, people talk about this. People talk about this in North America, in all grasslands. And so we know that this is a global problem because people are defining it. Our question was twofold. One, is wildlife responding to it the same way regionally? Is the same things happening in Africa, as North America, as Australia, all the places they're reporting it? And two, are all taxonomic groups responding the same way? And so we did this meta-analysis, one of my PhD students, and here's how I want you to interpret this. Take this meta-analysis. If you see the 0 line, anything above that line suggests that have a positive response to shrub encroachment. Anything below this line suggests that there's a negative response to it. So we looked at richness, we looked at diversity, and abundance. And what you can see from this is there's two groups that seem to be below that line, and that is South America and Africa seem to have negative responses. The wildlife patterns are showing negative responses from the studies that we looked at, right? I don't work in South America, so we'll talk about Africa instead. And if you see this, I've been working there for over 25 years, and you can see this with your own eyes. Places that you've gone to, and again, you don't know this because of fire, you don't know this because of overgrazing, but this is common. This is fixed point photographs from 1925, 1993, 2011, to give you some idea of what this might look like. And I wouldn't have you focus on the hill, I would have you focus on that savanna plain and see how much that has changed over that time and how that is now almost a woody-dominated system that we're seeing. So if that is the case, are all taxonomic groups responding the same way to this? Are we seeing the same response of mammals, birds, herpetofauna, right? And when we did the same analysis, you can look at the graph and you can look at it the same way. Well, birds do great. You just provided a lot more niche space for birds. We know that their composition changed, but they generally do quite well. Mammals, reptiles and amphibians, not so much. They're not responding well to this increase of shrubby encroachment within this savanna system. And that's a broad, again, overlook of all of these studies. As someone who studies mammals, and that's generally what my focus of my program on, I think this is lumping all mammals together, but certainly all mammals don't perceive the environment the same way. And we would expect that something like a rodent would perceive shrubs and changes in shrubs very different than something like a large mammal like a zebra or impala, kudu. Some large mammal would perceive this environment. So we wanted to see, well, are all mammals, is this a monolith? Are they all responding in the same way? So finally, we got away from analyzing other people's studies. We got out in the field, and we had sites. We had over 120 sites that we had where we kind of stratified, and we had lots of sites that were open, that didn't have this shrub layer. We had some that had a shrub layer, but you can still see that there is some grass in there. Maybe you guys can see that, I promise. If you look there, there is. And then we had some other areas where there was more shrubs and it choked out all the grass and there was a much more dense shrub layer. And so we looked across this. I'm going to use this kind of diagram at top to kind of show you the ideas of what I'm trying to represent up top there. So those are our research sites. Okay, so we looked at the response of large mammals, things like these guys running in front of our cameras all the time, and this was pretty straightforward. As you increased shrubs, well, the diversity of large mammals went down. We went from an average of 7 or so to just over 3.5 individuals per our plots as a function of the shrub cover. So large mammals are not having a great response to this. Then we did what my favorite thing is to do, is put traps out, catch lots of small mammals. We did this for over 4 years. Lots of tagging, lots of people getting bit by rodents, and we're looking at the same response. I've got the woody cover, which is our measure that we were using for the shrub cover here, and I'm just presenting the same data in a different way. Every line represents a different species. If the line is colored, that's a significant response, and the black line represents the overall community response. So most things that are responding significantly are increasing with woody encroachment, except for this one guy, which is a generalist that doesn't like tall grass, but overall the community is increasing. So we have patterns that are going in different directions. And this is another global pattern that we see, that as we lose large mammals or there's any stress on an environment, large mammals are replaced by small mammals. Right? This is a global phenomenon that we're seeing here, and it's happening on this same gradient that we see of woody encroachment. And this is just a schematic to give you some idea. But here's where the fun starts. Why? Why is a rodent perceiving this environment very differently than a large animal? And thinking about how animals view the world. If we set aside their thermal needs, I know I'm taking big leaps here, and we set aside their reproductive needs, again, just put those aside, here's what they're thinking. I want to get some food, and I don't want to be eaten. Right? Those are the two things that they have to trade off in their lives, right? I want to have some food, and I don't want to be scared out of my mind, afraid that I'm going to be eaten. So those are the two main hypotheses that we have for why an animal would respond differently in these areas. The reason that we think the reason might be food is because as you increase shrub encroachment, you choke out grass. Most of these things eat grass. But as you change the structure of the woody vegetation, you also create hiding places for some predators, and you also conceal other animals. So it might change how they're perceiving how vulnerable they are to predation. These are the two competing hypotheses that we wanted to look at. And so the first thing, I just take this same data again, and we might expect that if food was an issue, we would expect that those species that increase, maybe they were eating something different. Maybe these things are eating seeds, they're granivorous or they're omnivorous, but they're not eating grass. And when we looked at that, well, there actually was completely no pattern. The thing that was responding the best to woody cover was a herbivore, right? Just eats grass, right? So there doesn't seem to be any pattern, at least in this set of data for that. For large mammals, and please don't read that, I just clipped the PDF and put it up there to show this is a great science article written by one of my colleagues and some of the people who do a lot of work in Kenya. And what they did is they cleared areas. Took some areas that had shrubs, that cleared them. They had radio-collared impala, a deer-like critter, and they quantified the amount of food in the environment. And they said, listen, these things are not going into the uncleared areas relative to the amount of food that's there. Because there's a lot of food in there, and we know that they eat it and they're not going in it. So the reason for this must be because they're scared. That's what they said, published it in Science, well done. I wish I could come up with ideas like that. I can't. But what I can do is I can test their hypothesis, which is what we did here. And the idea is, well, if that is really the case, because they didn't test it, then if we look at how animals, large animals, respond in cleared versus uncleared areas, well, they should be much more scared of things in uncleared areas. So we did an experiment. We had cameras attached to that camera. After an animal comes into view, it records for about 10 seconds. Then it plays a call. Sometimes that call is just a bird, which is a bird that they should hear all the time. That's our control. Other times it's going to play something really scary. And if the animal is scared, the main thing it can do is run away. And it should look something like this. Okay, we don't have any sound here, but there was a hyena going there. So there's the hyena. It runs off. And so we did this in enough places, we can quantify what the fear response is. And we did this endlessly. And what we found was that in our controls, when we played this call of this cool bird, which is a hoopoe, they weren't really very scared. Hoopoes are in the environment all the time. They're calling all the time. No response. But when we played predators and we played them in grassy areas, well, they didn't run nearly as much as when we played them in areas with thick shrubs that had been uncleared. So doing this experiment, we showed that this response of the fact that they were avoiding these types of areas appears to be a function of that they were scared. So what about small mammals? Now, I think it would be really cool to do the similar experiment for small mammals where we had little mini cameras and they're running in front of it, but we couldn't figure that out. So we did this in a very different way. And when you think about a small mammal, which I spent a lot of time thinking about this, they really just perceive the environment in about the size of this stage, right? That's their life. That's how they're moving around the environment. So we wanted to capture how on that scale of a small mammal, of a rodent, are they perceiving the environment. So we put a tray here, a meter into the bush with the camera on it, on the edge of the bushes, and then up to 3 meters away. So not very far. In fact, this is what it looks like. That's what our camera setup looked like. And what we have in here is we're using something called the giving up density. This is a standard measure, and the idea is really quite simple. If you're trading off between food and fear, and you standardize one of the two of them, it's got to be because of the other. So we put the same amount of food in each one of those trays. We made sure that all the rodents knew where they were. We made sure that they were visiting. They could find them. They've all got the same amount of food, and then we kind of make it a little hard for them to get. And then we measure how much time and food they're eating from each of them. And if it's the same amount of food, the place where they're eating is the place where they are less scared. So what did we find? Inside the bush, on the edge of the bush, lots of food is eaten, there's lots of activity, but as they move away from that into these grassy areas, what do you get? They're scared out of their mind. So we start putting the why together. Well, these large animals are feeling nice and safe out here. They've got open sight lines. They can't, they can see their predators. Nothing's going to sneak up on them. A leopard's not going to jump on their head. Alternatively, if I'm a rodent, I want to be in these bushes where an owl can't get me, or a hawk or something else like that, which are their main predators, right? So what we're seeing is a partitioning of this as a function of fear, or at least that's what it appears like. And so what can we do about this to make sure that we still have a functional group of large mammals using this environment? Right? Here's a really practical application. There's two things that I think broadly people consider when we do this. Well, we can hire teams of people, we can come out, and we can hack these things down, and we can squirt chemicals on them, and then we can try and burn them and make them go away. That's one approach we could take. The other approach we could take is we could rent some elephants for a couple months, let them run around. There's some logistical problems with that, and I will talk about some of the other problems with elephants that you could have, but we could, and they're excellent. They are great bulldozers. They could kind of clear some of this stuff out. But none of these are really long-term solutions, right? We're not really maximizing the ecological function of the system. So people have done some other work, and they've thought about this. And the first things they looked at, well, what about things that eat the plants? Impala eat them. Goats eat them. There's goats and impala everywhere. And they found, if you think about the stage that these plants go through, okay, once they become mature, they drop some seeds on the ground. Those seeds are on the ground for about 14 days. They germinate. And impala and goats will eat them here, and they can kind of limit the growth, but they don't stop it or reverse it. They can just kind of slow the progress of brush encroachment. And when they go to eat the seeds, it passes through their gut, they scarify it, and when it comes out, it's much more likely to germinate than it was before. So they're absolutely no help at all. But what can actually break this cycle is something that actually eats the seed itself and makes it non-viable. And those are rodents. When rodents eat seeds, they eat it, they crush it up, the thing is not going to germinate afterwards. So our question was twofold. One, if we put the seeds for this nasty thing out there, and if you've ever been in this environment, there's a reason they call it sickle bush, and it will shred you, right? So we put sickle bush seeds out there. That's generally the thing that's encroaching. And we put another seed out there of a common plant. One, are they selecting for them? Will they actually eat these things, out in the environment? And two, and in what environments do they do it? So we put up our setup. We put those seeds out in the environment in our different trays. And we put them in a whole suite of different environments. We put them, I just told you that they only are going to eat things under a bush. So I put them under a bush, right? But I can put them in a bush in an area where there's very little grass. I can put them in an area where there's a lot of grass. I can put them in an area where there's very little canopy, where there's lots of canopy, and we put them in all different types of environments. And here's what happened. When we put them under a tree in an area with lots of grass, they were very active. They're moving around. They're spending more time there. And they're eating a lot of these seeds, almost clearing out the trays of these seeds. They're eating these sickle bush and these encroachers. So when we think about this conceptually and how can we think about the ecological functions of rodents working in this kind of global problem, well, I've got this cycle of mature trees dropping seeds on the ground. In these grassy environments, a rodent will come and will eat those seeds and hopefully stunt or break this cycle. We're back here where I don't have lots of grass. There is nothing to break this cycle except for goats and impala, which are going to actually enhance this cycle by increasing germination. So it's possible that rodents can actually maintain this environment so that it can be viable for the larger mammals that use these types of environments. So one of the keys here is, if we want to make sure we have environments that can provide this function, is we can't have areas like this. And there are lots of areas in Africa that looks like this. And this is a function of overgrazing. And it's an area very culturally important to Africans, that they have cattle, have lots of cattle, and have grazing areas for this. This is something that we really struggle with. And we work with, and we're trying to work with communities on this. But one of the things that we really can control, or have more control over, is getting these vegetation dynamics right so that they maximize diversity within this 14% of protected areas that we have, right? So let's control the areas that we have. And as someone who's interested in diversity and wildlife and animals, we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we have the vegetation in the right condition to maximize diversity. One of the things that Savanna ecologists and managers agree upon is that what you need to maximize diversity is you need lots of complexity. You need areas with trees, you need areas without trees, you need area with grass, you need some areas together. You want this broad concept called heterogeneity. There's not one thing we want. We want lots of diversity of different types of vegetation. These things can help do them, they can also hinder them. Now when we think about how can animals shape vegetative complexity or heterogeneity, think of them as a disturbance. And I think most of you guys know, learn in basic ecology, if I have a disturbance, if I have a lot of a disturbance, it's going to really simplify the system, and that's going to break down ecological function. If I have a little bit, there might be some, but not a lot. But if there might be some sweet spot here of herbivory, herbivores coming in and out that would shape to make a complex system. And that's just a broad ecological idea. There's nothing fancy there. But what I want you to think about is the extremes. So, have any of you ever seen anything that looks like this? Do we have this in South Carolina? You guys have deer running? No, you shoot them, you kill them, don't you? Yes, good for you. Okay, you do not have that. I have no problem with that. I'm just saying. So, some of the places where I've lived up north, you can see this. There are deer everywhere, and if you go to look through the forest, you can't see anything. I mean, there it is. There is nothing growing. There is nothing living. People have done their research in this. There are severe ecological problems when there's lots of herbivory. Now, you might know this for deer, but you might not know this for sea turtles. Can do the same thing. They can overgraze seabeds and have severe ecological consequences for seagrass beds. And koalas, yes, even koalas can destroy eucalyptus forests. And there's a lot of areas in Australia where they're trying to come up with some kind of control so that there's not collateral damage for this. Now, we know this. These things are accepted. They're published. You can read them. They're fine. Now, here's where things get a little strange. If you try to say this for elephants, the going logic, the current logic, or hopefully we've ended that logic, is that no, you can't have too many elephants. There's no such thing, and they do not cause ecological decay in the system. And to give you, just to drive this home, I'm going to give you a quote from, this is Robert Guillemont, who works with a guy named Rudy Van Arter, who is the authority. He's the elephant guy. He gets lots of money to study elephants. And here's what they said in 2007, +1 article. Elephants have no negative cascading effects for the species that share space with them. That's a broad statement. And here's the data that they showed with this meta-analysis. I want to show you to you because it makes me chuckle a little bit. Doesn't have to make you chuckle, but what they said is same plots that I showed you before, but we flipped them around. 0 is no effect. Positive is a positive effect. Negative is a negative effect. They looked at abundance, processes, populations, diversity. They looked at all these metrics. They're all negative. But because their confidence intervals cross that line, they made that statement. And that is the current logic that we were dealing with, is that there is no such thing as too many elephants. Why is that the case? And the reason that that probably is the case is because it is true that there is a declining elephant population. Broadly, the continent of Africa for the last 15 years has had severe problems with poaching, and that is what our current trends are with elephants. But that doesn't tell you the whole picture. The whole picture looks a little more like this. These areas here in green, they have 4 to sometimes 10% annual growth. There are some places that have 2 elephants per square kilometer. There are some places that are losing elephants at a rate of 30% a year. So there is a huge disparity in the pattern that I just showed you. And in some of these areas, in southern Africa, some areas in East Africa, there is incredible growth of elephant populations, right? So that's where these kind of desperate ideas come from. And so what we wanted to do is just spell out some basic stuff. Hey, if I've got abundant elephants, do I simplify vegetation? And if I have simplified vegetation, does it decrease diversity and influence ecological function, right? Just very simple things. We're trying to make elephants like everything else. And so I showed you a herbivory idea. Here's how we can think of herbivory in this system. So I've got impala, other ungulates running around, and then I've got the big bulldozers, right? And when the big bulldozers, elephants, come in, they're going to drastically increase the amount of herbivory that's going in the system. So we did a natural experiment. We had two broad areas, and both of these areas had elephants until 1920. They were killed out by the same elephant hunters. They came through the continent. We've got all their logs. We know when they were there. In one of these systems, in the 1940s, elephants came back. In the other system, they didn't, right? So same, everything else is the same. We same general management regime, same soil, same rainfall. We're trying to control for everything else except for this difference in elephants. And the one site where they came back and they haven't managed them since the 70s, and they are growing at a rate of 6 or 7% a year. So if we were to kind of capture on this gradient where these two broad areas are, we probably have one area here that has everything except elephants, and then we've got one area down here that have lots of elephants. That's kind of broadly at the areas on this curve where we're looking. Here are our sites. Again, we're in Swaziland. We're in north of Swaziland, about 100 kilometers in Kruger National Park. We had two broad spatial scales. We had over 90 plots, but we had plots clustered, and these are quarter-hectare plots, but we had them clustered in 15-hectare groups, right? So we had two broad spatial scales. We went out and sampled. We collected data on small mammals, bats, birds, and all of the vegetation, grass, shrubs, trees. We're still doing this to this day, but the stuff I'm going to present is after 3 years of working on this. What did we find? And the first question we wanted to know is what explains differences in the overall vegetation patterns, in those shrubs, in the canopy, in the complexity, which I'm calling heterogeneity. And as an ecologist, when you run an analysis and you find that your best explanation explains 48, 52, and 47% of your data, like you should stop right there. And I probably should have stopped right there. We never found that. All the patterns that we were explained. We looked at every variable we could, and elephants were the best explanation for that, except for grass, which changes annually, generally as a function of whether there was a drought or not, or whether there were lots of rains. So to show you what that looked like, those don't show up very well, but bear with me. We've got no elephant sites, and we've got elephant sites. On the no elephant sites, we see there's a good spread of shrubs, not so much on the elephant sites. Same with canopy, heterogeneity. We've got lots of different heterogeneity here, very little here, and kind of a little more spread of grass. So there is no shrubs, there's no canopy, and there's no heterogeneity on sites where we had these abundant elephants. I don't know how much you guys know about elephant ecology, so I'll just tell you some basics. Not only do they eat lots of stuff, they have a tendency to do two other things that change the vegetation. One, bulls particularly like to knock down trees. We don't really know why, but they'll do it. Sometimes they'll knock it down, they'll eat a little root and walk on. Sometimes they'll eat lots of roots and walk on. The other thing they will do, if you can see that, you can see where the bark has been removed there. They take their tusks, they dig them, they go around a tree, and if they keep going around the tree and they're sucking the water out of that during the dry season, they've effectively girdled the tree and killed it. So those are other ways that they actually change the vegetation. Those are two things that they do. So understanding that vegetative complexity really was highly linked with elephants, we wanted to see did that change animal diversity. So we took all of the measures that I told you about. We had rodents, bats, small mammals, and we aggregated them together, because the reason I aggregated them together is they all showed the same pattern. 0 here means average diversity, and if we look in areas with elephants, very little diversity, and we did it at 2 scales. This is my 15-hectare scale, and this is my quarter-hectare plot. So at broad scales, in areas with little shrub cover, little canopy cover, and little complexity, i.e. abundant elephant areas, we had very little diversity of any of these things. So when I presented this to the managers of Kruger National Park, who give me permits to do research, and they asked for reports and to do it, and they actually believe in adaptive management and changing their policies based on stuff, I said, hey, here's what we're finding. You guys make the judgment on it. And they said, who cares? Who cares if we're losing some species that we have in other places? It was a fair enough argument. It's like, you're not saying, Bob, that those are gone from the entire environment. You're just saying in these areas that you're looking, they're not there. And we also said, okay, well, the other thing that it should influence is ecological function. It's one thing to say, okay, well, I've lost a couple species, but it's also saying, well, the environment is working differently. And so the way that we looked at this is, if you think about what an animal does in the environment, and I'm going to use birds as an example, not mammals, is they can be pollinators, they can regulate insects, they can create cavities, they can seed disperse, they do a lot of things. For all of our species, we took global databases where you can quantify every species and every trait that it has. And then you can look at the diversity of those traits. And you can correct for the number of species on each site. So I can have a site with 2 species and 10 species, and I can look at what the relative diversity should be. So I'm correcting for the fact that some sites have more species than others. And what did we find when we looked at that and asked the same questions that we did before? We saw the same pattern. The ecological diversity, or the diversity of traits and functional diversity, was incredibly low in these shrub canopy area, in the shrub areas, canopy areas, heterogeneity areas where we had elephants. So what we tried to do with this paper that we published was kind of just spell out what we thought was pretty clear. If you have abundant elephants, I'm not saying elephants, I'm saying abundant elephants. If you have abundant elephants, you can simplify vegetation, and you can reduce diversity and reduce ecological function. And you can have areas that look like this. And that might look like a beautiful grassland, but that does not look like a savanna that I showed you that has a shrub layer and a canopy layer that looks like a grassland. So that's what your areas can look like. And so overall, I would conclude that really there's not a lot of difference in ecologically how you can think about an elephant or a sea turtle or a koala. We all have conservation value, but in heavy abundances, they can do some severe ecological damage. So that gets to the last part of my talk, which will be quick here. There's 2 big things that we didn't answer with that. That was a correlative study, so we have no mechanistic cause. I can't prove to you that it's elephants. I don't know that. The other thing is, we might have missed the sweet spot in this herbivory curve, because all I really had was animals here, and I had lots of elephants. I didn't have elephants coming in and out of the system, probably which they would have done naturally as they move sometimes up to hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers, and move and stay in places and are moving across the environment. So here's what we did. We put up fences, and by putting up a fence, I can look at this portion. I can see what happens if I just remove all herbivory. And I put up another fence, a bunch of other fences. And for those ones, we said, hey, everything can get in, impala, kudu, you can come in and out, but elephants, no, you're going to hit that very high voltage wire up top, and you will not want to come in. Again, they still will knock these things down. We know we'll have to fix them, but it will deter them for quite some time. It will also deter giraffes, but there's not a lot of giraffes because there's not a lot for them to browse on in this system. And then if I have open plots, I've captured this area here too. But what we haven't still captured doing this experiment to determine is it really elephants, and what can maximize vegetative complexity and thus diversity in the system, I need one more manipulation. And to get at that, what we're going to do is we're going to take our elephant exclosures here. These things are meant to keep elephants out. And then for a certain time, we're going to drop the fence. And we're going to let elephants come in like they probably naturally would have done, come into areas. They're going to defecate. They're going to drop seeds on the ground. They're going to put some nutrients in the thing. Maybe they're going to rip up some trees and shrubs. We don't know. When they've hit a certain density that matches the other densities that we've seen, then we're going to take helicopters and kick them out and put the fences back up again. And by doing that, we hope to see if we can capture what maximizes complexity in that environment. And is it this level of elephants are actually good for the environment, but only when they're coming in and out on a temporal scale and not on the activity levels that they currently are now. So to wrap up, what we are focused on in the areas that we can control is really maximizing that diversity and that structural heterogeneity through the management of animals and finding out what maximizes diversity. Outside of these areas, we also can leverage the complexity of landscapes to get diversity broadly that couple with these managed landscapes. And I can think of these challenges. If you think of complexity, I can think of these challenges as opportunities. If I've told you I've got a very dynamic landscape and I've got some things that are enhanced by agriculture, birds are enhanced by shrub encroachment, and I can manipulate things with this, well, hopefully combined, we can take these efforts to maximize diversity within this landscape. And that really is what my goal is moving forward with my research program in Africa. At this point, I should show you a slide with like hundreds of graduate students and technicians, and I should thank them all for their hard work, but like I didn't have all their pictures. So instead, I'm going to show you some logos and thank our sponsors, but I just want to thank you guys for taking some time out of your afternoons to listen to what we had to say about my African program. Thank you.
There's time for questions.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you investigated how hunting pressure from humans influences habitat selection by elephants, and whether that's affecting how they interact with vegetation communities.
I have and other people have, and some of the coolest studies I've ever seen are on this, and what they did was they played human voices, and they played human voices from two different Kenyan tribes, one of which hunted them and the other which did not, and they only were influenced by the ones that hunted them. And then they played from that same tribe. They played males and females, and they only moved away from the males. And then they took the male vocalizations, and they changed the pitch to match women, but they still knew it was men and ran away because of the way that they spoke. Elephants are smart. Yeah, I wish I could come up with cool ideas like that. Yeah, cool stuff. Yeah.
I'm curious how much of an impact like a loss from corridors between areas has an impact on like elephant density, and is there a push to make more corridors to kind of let elephants, even if they are an abundant population, kind of leave an area, go to a different area, and come back, and have that kind of...
Yeah, I mean, that's something that they've been talking about ever since there was a ban on ivory trade, which when there was a ban on ivory trade, all these countries pretty much stopped culling elephants, and the idea was we need to create super parks that connect them all together, and it's a great idea. They've been talking about it for 20, 30 years, right? We can link up these areas in Southern Africa, or in South Africa, with Zimbabwe and Mozambique. Here's what happened so there's a massive park on the other side of Kruger that's in Mozambique, which is a civil war for 30 years. And so they dropped the fences, and they kind of forced some elephants across. And you know what they did? They turned around and came home. They said, that place is scary. There are people in there. This is not where we want to be. So I think it looks like a good idea. I think we all, as conservationists, get that these were massive creatures that were wandering across the entire continent, and that there is not a park. Kruger Park is the size of New Jersey, and it is not big enough to contain their natural processes, period. Right? We all get that. That's just not the reality that we're living in right now. Yeah.
So, you present this to Kruger managers. Are you advocating elephant control?
No, someone's going to ask that question. It is the proverbial elephant in the room. Like, so what do you do, right? What do we do about this? And here's the. I'll give you the simple and the long answer. The simple answer is they're not going to lethally manage elephants. Period. That is off the table. That is a political decision. There is no will for that. What they are talking about is some of these ideas of how do we create heterogeneous landscapes with fear, how do we effectively make towns in the bush or virtual towns in the bush by having rangers patrol the same area, by putting speakers of humans in the same, how do we just kind of make this area like, hey, you don't want to come here, right? That's what because they're saying it's okay if I have some areas that are totally hammered by elephants. It's just not okay if my entire park is entirely hammered by elephants. So they're trying to, one of the things that they did is they said, the going idea was, hey, listen, when there's a drought, water will go away, elephants will die, this will take care of itself. There was just the biggest drought in 100 years in South Africa. Everything died, elephants went up 5%. Like, didn't work, right? So now it's plan B, which is like, okay, maybe we can find ways to, kind of manipulate them. And again, they do talk about this. Okay, you might have to scare them and you might have to shoot one, just so the others know that you're serious. And they do talk about that. Not culling a whole herd, but actually inducing fear to keep them out of certain areas. But there is not a good solution currently. Yeah?
What influence do the safari vehicles have on shrub encroachment?
Certainly roads do. Putting roads into what I've found in tourist areas is it's actually great for shrub encroachment because tourists don't like to look at shrubs, so the managers go out and always clear the shrubs by the road so that they don't have to look through them. But I haven't really looked at that, and I don't know the answer to that. One of the things they have looked at is will animals spend more time by the road because they know that they're safe, and they generally seem to say, oh, I'm going to hang out on this road, but then occasionally there's a pack of lions that only like to run up and down the road, and that changes. But yeah, I can't broadly answer that question. Stephen.
So you're talking about in some areas there's an increase in elephants like 4 to 7%.
Yeah.
I don't have a good understanding of like how large are the herds and how many elephants does that really represent?
Again, so if you could think of, you could think of this campus and think of what a square kilometer looks like. Now, scale that times 1,000 and put 2 in every one of those square kilometers. That's a lot of freaking elephants. Like you can't spit and not hit an elephant in some of these places. In Kruger, it's much lower than that, but there are places that are triple my system, what I'm talking about right now. Yeah.
I just have some experience with snakes, and they move snakes around. They haven't thought about moving the elephants around. I understand the logistical issues are probably a nightmare, but have they talked about just like tranquilizing some and taking them to areas with lower elephant populations?
Oh yeah, Kruger Park will give you all you want. You want elephants? I got a place for you. They will give you the elephants. You come pick it up and take it. It's all yours. Knock yourself out, right? And in Swaziland, where I worked, they had a small area of elephants, very small enclosed areas. And what they found is those elephants were starting to knock down the fence because they'd eaten all the damn trees in that area. And now, if you'd like to see them, they're in the St. Louis Zoo. They said, here you go, off you go, and they uploaded. So there is not, that goes, having a small fenced area with elephants is often a bad idea because they are going to eat themselves out of house and home, and then they're going to get angry. And that is what's happened in a number of situations. Hey, I look forward to talking to you guys this evening, continuing this conversation. Thank you so much for hosting me and being great audience. Thank you.
We'll be going to back streets here in the next few minutes, so you're welcome to this conversation.
I got New England. It's like, it's not really national, and it's a little hard to get government. Like, right, I mean, like, Cumberland Plateau, right?
So far away.
Yeah.
No,
I should have done that. And she was in so, like, looking at, like,
Because you just do your CI here, and then you spend your CI money out of your CI. There you go. Okay, we're gonna take this money over to you.
entirely. It's like investment money. I can see it in the paper. They just tell you you can do whatever you want with the money. What it really would have been good for is if we could have done one like last semester, and then you could have had them like all of your papers,
You're like, I was
stuff, like I could have done
which is their seminar thing, freshwater research.
you them just chip all that out.
We're like increasing over that. It's like more than a 5. Not sure yet.
Yeah, I just realized today I was looking at my
and so still like working on
availability trees. I noticed that it was one day, like I had one roost day that I tracked the same tree as I did like 2 of the other days. It was in the tree for like 3 days, and I just didn't do like 2 available ones for that one. I guess that's fine, but like
I met yesterday, and she was like, I want to
yes.
and it's not that.
You're gonna get a. I don't even give you tax meetings, and I can tell you what 60. That's not the campus if you would like to. Yeah. No, it's at like 8:30. Let me check.
I'm not sure. There was like some master's students that wanted to do for their undergrad, and I like immediately, I guess, put
But they're all postdocs.
People love like I just learned about the $2 bill. I did not know.
8:30 down there.
yeah.
I'm not know but he had just like she was she was like, do you need any more money from the swing group? You still have $209 left. Yeah, we can just cover that for you.
They know people are going to come back to them.
$65.
Yeah, I know. And like it always comes to people who are learning economics. I wonder if I can get them to like give me money for something. I'm trying to think if I like need $10.
Yeah, it's a waste.
I don't care about any of it. Like I got there.
I was gonna say I could cover like the hotel. Although I think it has like yeah, I think it's just looking at like when the money needs to not available, but it's also providing like writing